Hey internets! So there's a big problem that's been going around the web in terms of alleged intellectual discourse these days, and that problem is the fallacy fallacy problem, which is a type of argument that puts forth this concept that because an idea has been argued for poorly, then either that idea itself is bad, or an idea that opposes it somehow becomes a good idea, just because it's been argued for poorly. For example, saying that the sky is blue because cactus divided by cat butt. Now that's obviously a pretty silly and very wrong argument for the fact that the sky is blue. I'm pretty sure cactus and cacti have nothing to do with it, but does this prove that the sky is in fact red or not blue? Of course not. Stupid explanations for a fact don't magically make that fact not a fact, and it certainly doesn't prove that an opposing objectively wrong idea somehow becomes true in its place. But of course, that's a really obvious example. I'm pretty sure that just about everyone can figure out why cactus and cat butt are irrelevant to whether or not the color of the sky is blue. But sometimes, especially when it comes to YouTube pseudo-intellectualism, especially BreadTube and closely aligned ideologies, you might find examples of the fallacy fallacy that are not so obvious, and actually can trip the average person up. One example I've gone over before on my channel was Sean's arguments against the 1776 report. He pointed out various errors in the report, various nitpicks, while using this to imply that the 1619 project was good. But as I went over in that same video before, no, the 1619 project was not good. It contains multiple economic and ethical problems, along with being just blatantly cherry-picked, race-baiting propaganda, mostly designed to use victimhood to take advantage of people's insecurities so they could push an extremely far-left narrative without really facing much pushback, with the final two chapters being especially terrible. Random errors from generic conservatives in an attempted refutation of the 1619 project doesn't make the problems of it magically go away. But this video is not intended to be a recap on Sean. Instead, I'm going to showcase another example of the fallacy fallacy, specifically from a different channel that I found unfortunately does this even more often than Sean does. And that would be iilluminaughtii. Now, a part of me wasn't really going to make this video because honestly this channel has kind of fallen from grace due to a certain drama relying around certain false accusations of intellectual property infringement, which I'm not going to get into because A, other people have already done so in autistic detail, and B, quite frankly, I don't care. I really, really don't care. But I've decided to use her channel as a good example of the fallacy fallacy anyway, because it's a pretty decent example. I'm not really making this video to make fun of her, just as a good showcase of what the fallacy fallacy is. And in order to show off what I'm really talking about here, I'm going to focus on her video on the woke mindset. The basic gist of it is she starts out poking fun at Bethany Mandel for having a brain fart on live TV while being unable to define woke, which she then cuts to Fox News where another anchor says that woke is just a feeling. From this, she concludes that the definition of wokeness is unclear and doesn't actually matter, and then proceeds to spend the rest of her video using this false premise to whine about various conservative talking points when those conservatives use the word woke in them. What makes this ridiculous is that iilluminaughtii, of course, did not do her homework at all. For instance, if you actually read Bethany Mandel's book, Stolen Youth: How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation, she does actually have somewhat of a better idea of what wokeness is in the book. In it, she wrote, "Wokeness became the enforcement of a narrow set of values and a policing of language. It is now a method to shut down any alternate opinions, even those within the same general range. It's a system characterized by intolerance and showing one's own superiority by denouncing those who step out of line. And though woke ideology centers a very different set of people than the USSR did, the methods are eerily similar." And she then proceeds to just kind of further allude on that. So Bethany Mandel definitely has some kind of understanding of what wokeness is. Her only crime is that she hasn't really thought of a simplified, easy definition to use. And so when push came to shove in the context of a live interview, she couldn't really come up with a simplified version of the 200 plus pages that she wrote. And thus she just ended up having a gaffe where she didn't say anything at all. Just as a side note, this is one of the problems with live interviews and debates. Just because someone slips up doesn't necessarily mean they don't know anything. It just means that they couldn't come up with an easy answer in the spur of the moment for you. And then of course the Fox News anchor, well, that's just Fox News being Fox News. And this is where iilluminauttii's video response to it just kind of gets a little bit weird, because she recognized that Bethany wrote this book, but she clearly didn't read it. So instead we get a 30-minute rant from her in regards to the gaffe instead of what was actually in the book. But even then, there's plenty of other people on the right who have given pretty decent explanations for what the definition of woke is. For instance, my own definition, which is an aggressive push for diversity, equity, inclusion, usually based on the belief that outcomes which lack these things are indicative of discrimination and/or unfair social treatment. And there's a lot of other rightoids out there who've given similar definitions, some of them more focused on the aggressive part, and some of them more focused on the DEI part, leading into basically the equity fallacy, or the faulty argument that tries to claim that because unequal outcomes exist, discrimination must exist, which is not actually true at all. The basic problem of what's going on here is that Illuminati decided to refute, in quotations there, a collection of bad takes on what wokeness is, while deliberately ignoring other takes, and then acting like she has somehow exposed that the right-wing position on wokeness is in fact just a mind virus to try and justify power, which is absolutely ridiculous because when you actually study the meaning of woke at length, you quickly discover that the opposite is true. Wokeness makes use of the equity fallacy to justify a fundamentally evil and aggressive Marxist agenda, which is then very often used to justify bigotry towards groups that have higher than average representation and success. In this regard, the fallacy fallacy is very similar to a straw man argument, but not quite the same. The difference is that FF relies on an actual bad argument that has in fact actually been made, but then it pretends like that bad argument is the only argument that exists for that idea by deliberately ignoring better material on the subject at hand. In the case of her video on the woke mind virus, the entire thing can be summarized as, look at this silly woman who is unable to simplify her book on live TV, and look at this silly Fox News anchor. Now let's not go into this further, and let's not read her book at all, and not research the subject at all, and instead proceed to make a 30-minute video built on these flawed arguments. Slow clap. And you might be wondering, how do I know for sure that Illuminati did not read Bethany's book? Well, that's because one of the first things that she whines about is that the definition of woke used to be something tied to the black community, and how it simply meant being aware of the world around you, or the racism you might encounter. But the thing is, that definition is in Bethany's book. She also mentions that on page 20. The term woke was once used by the black community to describe someone who stays alert to racism in society, and yet Illuminati is accusing her of being someone who has no idea what she's talking about. And then Illuminati proceeds to try and contradict Bethany on something that Bethany wrote, while agreeing with Bethany, because of course Illuminati did not read her book. Otherwise she would know that she's contradicting her on something that they actually agree with. And then further on into this video, things start to get even worse and we start to find even more examples of the fallacy fallacy. For instance, she proceeded to babble on about The Little Mermaid and those terrible conservatives who called it woke just because Disney made the new Little Mermaid black. Now, there were a few people who did that and stopped it at that, and yeah, that was a bad argument, but there was also a lot of people such as myself who pointed out that the real problem was that of double standards. Most leftists would agree that whitewashing a POC character just to appease their audience for the sake of representation is a racist thing to do, but that's exactly what The Little Mermaid was doing and what Disney was doing in reverse. They're just blackwashing a character who was white, again for the sake of representation. Probably more so to appease the cathedral, in a textbook example of prestige-seeking behavior. And that's a contradiction. It shows that they don't actually believe that race swapping is bad on any kind of principle. Modern woke progressives try to simultaneously push the contradictory claims that colorblindness is racist, but also that the color of a character's skin doesn't matter when it is being swapped, which of course shows that the woketoids do not actually believe in either of these things, and their words are therefore just dishonest excuses to push intersectional identity politics and justify their power, which ironically in the end are actually harmful to both the black community and to white people. But of course, Illuminati doesn't go into any of this. Instead, she commits yet another fallacy fallacy by refuting the claim that it was scientifically inaccurate to cast Bailey in the role, which admittedly was a very poor argument from Matt Walsh for why The Little Mermaid's live action was woke, and people should stop using this argument, trust me, it is bad, and even he probably understood this, which is why he later stated that it was a joke. And Illuminati's points against it are correct, but again, just because she's correct on her points against that bad argument, that doesn't disprove the better arguments out there that explain why it is woke by pointing out the contradictions in leftist identity politics. She completely circumvented the entire discussion on whether or not reverse racism is a problem, or if the term reverse racism is even a meaningful distinction or not. She then proceeds to go on again about Fox News, complaining about forced representation in Legos, doing pretty much the same thing with the same faulty argument. And this is where the problems of this fallacious reasoning really start to show. Illuminati then combines all of this with her faulty premise of what people on the right are saying wokeness is, to conclude that the word woke is a dog whistle used by people trying to hide bigotry, which is pretty much the most milquetoast and wrong conclusion she could possibly reach. But I can totally see how blue-pilled normies could fall for this, since much of the mainstream media never really exposes people to the deeper explanations. I mean, going back to my simplified example, the sky is blue because cactus divided by cat butt. Pretend for a moment that there was a media network that was trying to convince their audience that it's red, that the sky is actually red. Also assume that their audience knows what a cat and a cactus is, but has absolutely no idea what the sky is, and that everyone who watches this hypothetical network is not only completely colorblind, but also has zero knowledge of the color spectrum or how light reflection and refraction works. If such an audience existed, they actually could be potentially convinced that the sky is red because cactus divided by cat butt doesn't make any sense. Because when a person has knowledge of one side of the equation only, but is completely clueless about the other side, it's actually really easy to fall for this kind of propaganda. And that's exactly the problem with what Illuminaughtii is doing here. She didn't put any good faith effort in whatsoever to really find out what wokeness really means, instead opting to string together a series of bad arguments in a sort of clown case of the blind leading the blind, which inevitably leads her audience to claim that woke is basically just a newtsy doog whistle and has no real meaning beyond that. And this painfully wrong conclusion happens only 1/3 into her video. From that point on, the rest of her video is pretty much little more than a rant about all of these right-leaning think tanks and parents are all just a bunch of cryptos. And because they are all just a bunch of cryptos, therefore there is nothing wrong with DEI training, and the reason that Silicon Valley Bank crashed had nothing to do with wokeness. All of these arguments are built off her lack of understanding of what wokeness is, making the rest of her video unfortunately not really worth going into, because it's all just based off of this faulty premise, and the faulty conclusions she inevitably reached from it. And many of the rest of her videos are pretty much just vanilla blue pill stuff with a little bit of man who agrees with the establishment but thinks he's anti-establishment spice mixed in. Plus, again, the point I'm making here doesn't really have anything to do with Illuminaughtii at all. I'm just calling out a particular brand of intellectual laziness that I think has become all too common. The point I'm making here is that it's important to always look at least a little below the surface into discourse surrounding a topic before thinking you have any understanding of it. Because in many ways, the fallacy fallacy is very closely tied to the Dunning-Kruger Mount Stupid effect. It's very easy for a person with little to no understanding of subject X to see a bad argument about subject X, and then trick themselves into thinking that they now understand subject X. Well, unfortunately, no, that's not how it works. You have to research things a little bit further than that to make sure you aren't making these kinds of really basic mistakes. If you don't understand what one of the terms means, you have to look into what it means before thinking you can refute the whole stack. And if you're going to refute somebody based on a subject that they wrote a book on, you should probably consider actually reading their book, and potentially avoid the embarrassment of making an entire 30-minute video based on a faulty premise. I mean, seriously, I've seen a lot of poorly reasoned breadtube slop out there, but this particular video was just painful. Starting from a faulty argument in its premise and then just stacking additional bad arguments on top of that premise until everything just went unbearably wrong. So one thing I do to avoid making this fallacy myself is that I try to refute my own recordings. Yeah, I'll pretend to be a liberal sometimes, looking up reasons for why I am wrong after I've done doing the recording part of my videos, and in a few cases I actually did find an error or two. And it's an important self-check that unfortunately a lot of people out there just don't do. Not just on YouTube, but on Substack and even people on various internet discussion boards. It's extremely easy to paint oneself as some kind of intellectual by only attacking surface level and obviously wrong arguments. Heck, I admittedly do it just for fun in some of my less serious videos. It can be funny, but if you are not careful, it can also be very, very painfully wrong. It's very, very easy to refute people who are being dumb. It's very easy to find minor mistakes that people have made, especially live recording Mickey Mouse moments, and then make fun of that person and say, haha, they had a brain fart, therefore all of their arguments in life work is wrong. It's very, very, very easy to do that, but it's not actually a valid argument. Just because someone trips doesn't mean that that person is not capable of walking, and just because you can find cases where something has been argued for poorly doesn't mean that better arguments for the same subject aren't out there. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to tip, like, subscribe, comment, and all that algorithm stuff. Till next time.